Hello, everybody. My name is Claudio Morana, and I'm the director of CefES, the Center for European Studies of the University of Milano Bicocca. CefES is hosted by the Department of Economics, Management and Statistics of our university. It was established in 2018 as one of the pillars of a 5-year project funded by the Italian government. Since inception, the center has been very active in research on European issues and its dissemination. There are currently 17 active research projects related to the impact of COVID-19 and the broad areas of energy markets and climate change, macro and finance, governance and cooperation, management, history, and law. CefES gathers scholars from different fields in economics, political science, and law, with the objective of contributing to the empirical and theoretical debate on the European economy. We invite contribution from external researchers to current center's activities or new initiatives, in quality of external fellows. We also recently started an internship program. We have planned 2 workshops in the coming months. The first workshop is due next week and is focused on the future of European integration. The date is November 16. The second workshop is focused on the future of capitalism in Europe, and the date is December 13. You can find more information on our website. And also, please visit our website for additional information on all our activities. Today's webinar is part of a joint CefES-JRC scientific initiative. We are proud to carry on this initiative with the aim of connecting scholars all over the world and to strengthen their cooperation, particularly in this period of high human, social, economic, and political distress. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Marco Ratto of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission for his welcome remarks.
Thank you, Claudio. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marco Ratto. I work at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and we are very happy to be part of this webinar series together with CefES that provides very timely and useful webinars and help us to stay in contact with each other and then to confront with very topical issues. A few words on the Joint Research Center. The Joint Research Center, JRC, is the science and knowledge arm of the Commission, and we support EU policies by providing independent scientific evidence throughout the policy cycle. I work in the finance economy unit, and we provide support for the development of European Union policies based on state-of-the-art financial and economic research. I lead the macro modeling team in this unit, and we do macroeconomic modeling. We develop and maintain the European Commission's estimated DSG model, and we applied it to forecasting assessments, policy assessments in relation to macroeconomic and fiscal monitoring, twin transition and the recovery policy after the coronavirus pandemic. But it is it's a great pleasure to introduce you to Evi Pappa, who will present us her paper co-authored with Fabio Canova on what are the likely macroeconomic effects of the EU recovery plan. Evi is professor of macroeconomics at the University Carlos III Madrid, and probably we know her very well, all of us, and she's author of several papers on empirical economics, and okay, we look forward to her talk. So I give you the floor, Evi.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very glad to participate on this initiative. I really believe that policymakers and academics should converse, and I think that it is a great step towards this direction. So actually, what I'm presenting, not surprisingly, is very much policy related, and I'm glad that I have, like in the public, as I understand, both academics and policymakers. And I would be very happy if I am interrupted during my talk. If you have some clarification question or you think something that it is very relevant that you will not forget afterwards, feel free to interrupt me. I'm not going to be able to follow very much your raising of hands, but as long as I am concerned, you can just open your microphone and ask me whatever you want. So with that said, let me talk to you about what are the likely macroeconomic effects of the EU recovery plan. What we do in this paper with Fabio is that we start from a year ago on a crucial date when the EU federal fiscal budget was created. And in particular, we're interested at the next generation EU funds. And you all know by now what this is. So this is supposed to be a package of grants and loans that they're going to be given to different European countries in order to support the recovery from COVID-19 and also to foster the transformation of the digital economy and to a more, not only digital, but also more green economy. So the largest NGU fund here is the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and this was designed to counteract the negative effects of the COVID-19. Here, we're not talking about small numbers. The budget here is pretty big. We're talking about 13% of the EU gross national income when we talk about the total budget. And when we look only at the RRF, we're talking about a budget of magnitude of 5.5% of the EU gross national income. So this is a considerable fiscal expansion. And it is very atypical also because the objectives of this fiscal expansion is not just to be counter-cyclical, you know. Here we want to create jobs, but we also want to transform the economy and to be able to start a vicious growth cycle. So these grants are not like any usual fiscal policy that you might think. And in particular, what we're going to do is that we will take some grants that look like these grants that they were given in the past 30 years in Europe, and we will try to draw inference from this experience in order to be able to talk about the success of the new recovery plan. So what we will do is that we will study the regional dynamics that they are produced by two major EU funds in the past, that they have characteristics that they share with the recovery plan. And we will try to understand how the economy reacted to these funds in order to draw conclusions about what is going to happen to this new fiscal expansion. So the funds we're going to look at is the European Regional Development Fund, which was launched to foster R&D in innovation and to favor the digital agenda and support small and medium enterprises. And we will also look at the European Social Fund, which was launched to support investments in human capital, in education and health, and to fight poverty. So what we will do first is that we will construct a novel database of these regional funds that, as far as we know, didn't exist before. And we are going to collect stylized facts about the macroeconomic effects of the funds and try also to look at whether these effects are kind of common or there are heterogeneities. And when we will have our empirical findings, we will try to interpret them through a model in which we would be able to do policy experiments that we would not otherwise be able to do in the data. So the model is going to actually rationalize the average effects that I'm going to present you today, and it's also going to account for the heterogeneities that we're going to observe. So giving you a spoiler that we will find heterogeneities. So the question that we're asking in the paper is, given that the NGU current funds combine features of both the ERDF and the ESF funds, what is going to be the likelihood of success in terms of job creation, output growth, and inequalities of the NGU funds? Now, just in case I will not have time to go through the results, let me explain you a little bit what we find in the empirical analysis. Well, when we look at the ERDF funds, we find that on average, these have positive short-term impacts on all regional variables. However, typically, will show that in the average region, these effects are actually dissipate pretty fast in the medium run. And we would think that this would be probably good instruments for counter-cyclical policies. When we move and we look at the European Social Fund, we saw that this kind of fund on average has on impact an effect which is insignificant or even negative. However, when we move to the medium run, what we see is that these funds, no matter what kind of specification we're using, they generate robustly high average multipliers at the 3-year horizon, which is like our medium run. You know, the data is what they are. We cannot do too much about the long run that we're looking, the medium run. And they have multipliers, the ESF funds have multipliers that they're much higher than the ERDF funds. So it looks like that these funds could be probably a good idea to be used for economic transformation. Now, of course, there are some more results that we are going to present. We are going to talk about spillovers, and we will also look at anticipatory effects. And what is more important is that if one wants to go and see unit by unit what's happening, the distribution there is pretty ample. So in the sense that we have considerable heterogeneity in the transmission of these fund shocks that we're going to look at. And in particular, what we're going to show you is that location, national borders, membership to the EU, and tenure within the EU, so whether you are an old or a new member, will matter for the dynamic propagation of these fund shocks. Moreover, what we also see, which is kind of worrying, but also, I mean, it depends how one wants to interpret the findings, is that the great benefiters of these programs are middle income regions. The poor stay poor, middle income regions catch up, and the rich are not that much affected. So that means that we have this possibility of inducing income polarization within the European regions, and this is something that we don't like and probably we can't do something about. And I will come back to that when I will describe in more details the models. Given that I don't have a lot of time, there is different kind of literatures that we are touching upon, but basically, there is an early literature that looks at the effects of EU transfers on income inequality and on long-run growth that we relate to. They don't look at these funds that we're looking here, but they look at the cohesion funds, but it is related. Then there are models that they look at the effects of fiscal expansions in monetary unions. We are going to have also a theoretical model that is going to be a new Keynesian model of a monetary union, but we're going to extend this model by allowing for growth through human capital accumulation and accumulation in R&D. So it's going to be different. And then all the relevant multipliers that we have for fiscal policy usually concern government expenditure. We don't have multipliers that they talk about, multipliers of funds or of like expenditure that is going to affect growth. So we differ from the existing literature in this respect. Well, now talking about policy implications, what our findings suggest is that the structural funds could support a regional income, induce transformation, and ignite a virtuous investment cycle in Europe. Moreover, we show that when we actually cluster the units with the country characteristics, the national borders, we show that actually Spain, France, and Italy, which are the countries that they suffered a lot from the COVID, we still don't know exactly how this is going to end up, but like in the first waves for sure, we see that in these countries, the multipliers of both the ERDF and the ESF funds are higher on average. And so the outlook is kind of optimistic for the investments in these countries. The programs, as I said, may lead to increased polarization in Europe and higher regional inequalities. So some caution has to be given to this aspect of the new programs. And we believe that we need structural economic and public administration reforms in order to be able to produce generalized Pareto improving allocations and dynamics for all the regions in the EU. Now, the data that we use are coming from European sources. So we use the regional macroeconomic data of Ardeco, and we restrict the attention to 279 NUTS2 units. So this is something between a country and a region. And we have annual data on real gross value added, employment, real compensation, population, real fixed capital formation, and we construct the labor productivity issues by labor productivity series by using the GVA and an employment series. For the structural funds, we look at the European structural historical data, structural funds data, historical data that they are available online if you want to go and look at them. And of course, the European funds do not concern only ERDF and ESF. There is also the Cohesion Fund, the Agricultural Fund, lately the Fishery Fund. But we are going to concentrate to these two funds because they are kind of more related to our question, and also because they are not like related to convergence as like, for example, the Cohesion Fund. So I think I have explained to you already what is the ERDF and the ESF. So let me tell you a little bit about the data reporting problem. So what we have is that we have problems in the data reporting in the sense that we have time gaps between the expenditure in the EU books and the actual expenditure at the regional level. And the EU gives us some guidelines of how to deal with these problems. And but however, we figure out that we have also some additional problems. For example, there are some mistakes in the coding of the data, values appear in nominal terms, and we have tried to do our best to construct a database that it is like readily available and it is like consistent throughout. So just to show you an idea about how these funds look like, I just report here in this table the average yearly per capita real funds for different regions in Europe, and I report to you values for the top recipients, which are on the top of the panel, and the lowest recipient that they are on the bottom of this panel. So as you can see, Azores, for example, receives 851 euros per capita real funds, while, for example, Paris or Stockholm receive something like 8 euros per capita. So there is a big discrepancy in the allocation of the funds, and I think you can better see it in this graph, where you can see how with darker colors being the countries that they receive the over 200 euros per capita, while the lighter colors will go to less than 11 euros per capita. So you can see that it is mostly countries like peripheral countries like Spain, Portugal, Greece, the south of Italy, Ireland, and the north of England, as well as Finland, for example, or like the Baltic countries here that they receive, and of course the Balkans here, that they receive big amounts of this money. And other regions within Europe are receiving much less in terms of per capita funds. So without further ado, I will go to look at the econometric framework. So what we're going to do here is that we are going to use a Bayesian IV approach in order to be able to draw inference on the effects of these funds in the different macroeconomic variables we are interested in. As I said here, YIT is going to be the macroeconomic variables of interest. That for me is going to be GVA, employment, participation, the real weights, and all these aggregates. And I'm going to regress this on a constant and on its lagged values. And I will also regress it on this term XITH, where this XITH is going to be the difference in the fiscal stance or the fund, let's say, between period T and period H, in which I want to calculate the horizon of the response. And I'm going to actually normalize this difference with GVA. Why? Because you can see in equation 1, what I use on the left-hand side is actually the growth rate of GVA, let's say. So what I'm trying to do is that I want to construct directly, following Dupo-Renquerer, Ramesh, or Bairi, a measure of the cumulative multiplier for the different horizons that I'm going to consider. Okay, so why I say this is an IV? Well, because actually the expenditures here in the first equation, I'm going to instrument them with the innovations in funds that they're going to be independent from euro area variables like euro area GDP, employment, the GDP deflator, the nominal rate, and the nominal effective exchange rate. So in other words, what I'm trying to do here in using this this IV regression is that I am trying to control for the fact that, you know, sometimes funds are endogenous to the cycle. So if there is like more, if we are in an expansion, maybe we have more funds than if we're in a recession, or like some of these funds are actually co-financed in some regions. And as a result, if the times are good, then there is going to be finance for these funds, other like for complementary finance for these investments. Otherwise, the investments might never take place. So that's why we want to control for euro area business cycle conditions. Now, as I told you already, the sample here is short, and for that reason, we're going to minimize the horizon like to just 3 years, and we will use only one lag as a control for our experiments. I told you that I'm going to use a Bayesian approach, so I'm going to assume some priors for the constant, the lag effect, and the multiplier. And what I'm going to be doing is that these priors are not going to be informative, and for that reason, actually, what I do in terms of econometrics is like I am having an IV ridge estimator for the multiplier effect. So once we will do that, we will construct the cross-sectional distribution of multipliers for the 279 units that we consider. And we will report the trimmed average multiplier, where we're trimming like the 10 above and the 10 below quantiles in the distribution. And I'm going to present you the results when there is heterogeneity by not pooling the estimates, as most of the studies are doing, but instead by considering the estimation unit by unit. Why I'm doing that? Well, I can show you here that if we look, for example, at the equation for GVA, when we're looking like at the effects of the funds on GVA, what we see is that the lag coefficient, the dynamic coefficient here, this BH on output is very non-normally distributed, whether we look at 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year horizons cumulative. Okay, so for that reason, I am going to estimate the equation region by region. So what I'm presenting here in this table is the average cumulative multipliers that, as I have explained it, to you, I am presenting the trim median here. So in the left panel, you see the multipliers for ERDF funds, and in the right panel, you have the multipliers for ESF funds for different years, cumulative 1, 2, and 3 years. So what we see, if we look at the GVA, the gross value added, we observe that the impact multiplier for the ERDF funds is pretty high, it's 1.83, but as time goes by, and I remind you again that this is cumulative, we see that this number is actually becoming smaller, which implies that the shock actually dissipates, and so these multipliers do not remain high for a long time. And we see that the same is kind of true like for employment on impact, then it comes down, but like it increases in but not very much in the third year. We see for compensation, we have a similar pattern, and we have a similar pattern also for investment and labor productivity. Actually, labor productivity is dissipating very fast. And we see that here we even have a negative multiplier after 3 years, which is okay, it's insignificant. The only variable for which the multiplier is, the cumulative multiplier continues to increase with the pass of time is participation. So it looks like that participation is actually something that increases persistently after this kind of fund shocks. When we move and we look at the ESF funds, what we observe is that on impact, these funds have no effects. Negative, but actually if we look at the standard deviations in parentheses, it's almost zero. And as the time goes by, we see that these multipliers accumulate, giving us higher results if we move from 2 years even to 3 years, and we get a cumulative multiplier of 5 in 3 years after an ESF fund shocks, which means that if we spend 1 unit of funds for ESF, this in 3 years is going to give us 5 units of output. This is a big number. We are not worrying that this is a big number because, as I told you at the beginning, here we're not talking about normal fiscal policy. Here we are trying to estimate the effects of funds that they are supposed to affect growth. So finding multipliers of 5 in a 3 years horizon, we think it's reasonable. Of course, we cannot compare our results with other studies because other studies didn't look at this kind of fund shocks. So we will live with that, and we'll wait for you to do new studies and give us your estimates in order to be able to compare ourselves with something. So about the ESF funds, what we see is that the pattern of GVA responses is actually shared also by employment, although I have to say that the stimulative effect on output is much bigger than the stimulative effect on employment. Compensation is also increasing, as you can see, persistently, and investments are also increasing as the time goes by, and labor productivity as well. And participation is still increasing constantly as for the ERDF funds. Now, in the paper, I don't know, I have to check what time it is. Okay, so in the paper, what we do is that we look at different kind of scenario. For example, we look, what if we don't look at all EU countries, but we look only at the Euro area countries that they share the same currency? Do the results change? Well, I wouldn't say, actually they do change. They don't change for the ESF funds. Actually, the multipliers become bigger if you look here at the first column of the right panel. But for ERDF funds, we get kind of more persistent effects if we look only at Euro area countries. Now, we also look at the effects of the multipliers when we look at the data after 2000. And the reason we do that is because the data sources tells us that this misallocation of funds is like very much dealt with in the data after 2000, and also because we want to see if actually, you know, you take away the initial periods in which like countries are still evolving to catch up, whether we will see kind of different effects. And here we see that ERDF funds, again, might have more long-lasting effects than what we have estimated in the baseline model, while for the ESF funds, we robustly get the kind of same estimates that we were getting before. Now, we also would like to understand whether these funds generate spillovers. You remember that our unit is the region. So a region within a country, you know, it's much more communicative than like a country with another country. So for that reason, what we try to do in this table here is to measure the multiplier when we look at the effect of the fund shocks at the national level versus the regional level. So if it is true that there are spillover effects, then what we should observe is that this multiplier at the national level should be higher than the multiplier that we see at the regional level. And this is true for ERDF funds. So if you look at the numbers and compare them with the numbers I gave you in the baseline, I had like 1.83 for the first year multiplier. Now it is 2, and it's also increasing in the second period, while before it was falling much faster. But if we look at the ESF funds, actually the story is not the same. It doesn't look like we have any spillover from ESF funds. And actually, if you want to see that clearly, look at the responses of investment. Investment is negative, or like, okay, insignificant, but still negative, generates negative multipliers at the aggregate level, while what we have seen before, just in this table here, is that investment generated very high multipliers at the regional level. So it seems like that an investment of ESF funds in, an an ESF fund shock in Andalusia is actually going to increase investment in Andalusia, but is going to crowd out the investment in Murcia. I'm talking about Spain because this is what I know best. I could also talk about Reggio Calabria versus Reggio Emilia or something like that in Italy. But okay, that's not what I came here for. So, so what these tables that I show you indicate is that there are a lot of heterogeneities. So what we're going to do now is that we're going to try to cluster the units that we have in our analysis with using different characteristics to try to understand whether we can explain this heterogeneity. So the first thing that we do is we divide between north and south. Now the division is not geographical. So north here is going to be the good guys, like the in the sense like the countries that like did not have any problems like of growth or problems with their deficit. So here we have like Germany, Austria, Netherlands, etc. And in the south we have, of course, Portugal, Greece, Italy, but we put also Ireland, for example, and Hungary. So what we see is that if we look at the ERDF funds, I will concentrate on GVA, so so to not give you a headache. So we see that although in the north we have a positive effect which is comparable between the north and the south, we see that as the time goes by, the cumulative multiplier stays much higher in the south than what it is in the north for ERDF funds. Now, if we move to ESF funds, we see that actually in the south, these kind of funds have on impact very positive effects, while in the north, they generate first negative effects and then positive effects. And actually, if we look at the 3-year multiplier of ESF funds, we see that this multiplier is kind of double of what it is in the north, in the south, in the group of regions in the south. Another thing that we also look is that whether EU tenure matters. So we looked at all members of the EU versus younger members of the EU. So here you can think about Polonia, Bulgaria, etc. So what we see is that in the all members of the EU, the multipliers are pretty high for both the ERDF funds and ESF funds, especially in the medium term for ESF funds, while for the young members of the EU, we see that the multipliers are positive, for example, for ERDF on impact, but they become really negative, crazy negative in the second period. So like they just last one period. While for the ESF funds, again, for these countries, we see that actually they have a very different pattern than for the rest of the European countries. They increase on impact and actually they dissipate also in this case. So ESF funds do not seem to have long-run effects for these regions belonging in the younger tenure countries. The next thing that we looked is that we looked at heterogeneities that they have to do with income. So what we do in this graph is we look at income quartiles with the red line representing the first quartile, the blue and the black lines representing the second and the third quartile respectively, and the green line representing the fourth quartile of the income distribution of the regions that we have in our analysis. So what we see is striking, because if you look at any kind of multipliers, you will see that the multipliers for the second and the third quintile of the income distribution that we're looking are always higher, no matter what horizon I'm going to consider. And instead, we see that the multipliers of the green guys and the red guys are actually dissipating faster. And it is kind of misfortunate that it doesn't look like we have convergence, especially like for the first quartile. When we move to the ESF funds, we have a very similar picture. As you can see here, the medium run multipliers, remember in this fund, the impact multipliers are kind of 0 or negative. So we look at the third year multipliers, they're always big for middle income regions, but they're much smaller when we look at the first and the fourth quantile. So it looks like that we have caught up for the middle income regions, but at the same time, we have some kind of polarization. So then we have looked also at the borders. So we have clustered units according to the national borders. And what you see here is a color map in which we try to color with red color the units in which after 3 years, both the GVA and the employment cumulative multiplier is negative. With purple, the good guys, or the guys where things work, in which after 3 years, both the GVA and the employment multiplier are positive. And what you see here, which is Portugal, basically, with orange, is the case in which I have, after 3 years, a negative GVA multiplier and a positive employment multiplier. And what you see with green, the other countries, is Sweden and I don't want to go to the geography. I have to start studying this very carefully. What we see is that for these green guys, we have a positive GVA multiplier, but a negative employment multiplier. So what this says is that these grants are going to work for very few countries. For Finland, Spain, France, Italy, and Ireland, they will work, but like for the majority of Central Europe, they are going to give us medium-term multipliers that they are going to be very, very small or negative. If we look now at the ESF funds, the picture is very different. We see a lot of purples, which means that these grants generate positive employment and GVA multipliers in most of the regions. We have very few regions that are still red here. The big exception here is the UK, but we shouldn't care anymore. They're not in the European Union anymore, so that's fine. And some Balkan regions here, Bulgaria, but there are some problems for Bulgaria that we are talking in the paper. I don't have time to explain to you now. And but the picture looks kind of more optimistic in the 3-year horizons. So this was the data. Now I'm going to make the effort to explain you in 10 minutes how we explain these things in a theoretical model. I will try to be as intuitive as possible because I don't have time to present you all the model details. So I hope I'm clear enough and you can follow me. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to model my universe as a 2-country model of a monetary union, where I'm going to assume that the home country is very, very small. So like a region in the EU is pretty small. Now, the model is going to have standard new Keynesian features in the sense that I'm going to have adjustment cost, I'm going to have monopolistic competition, etc. What is going to be different with the other models that you probably have seen of this kind of type, the new Keynesian open economy models, is that we are going to have endogenous growth in R&D and in human capital accumulation. Actually, it's either one or the other. But for the slides, it's going to be the same. And I'm going to have a federal expenditure that is going to be financed with local income and lump sum taxes. And monetary policy is going to be conducted at the union level. And what is going to be key here for my analysis is that the federal government spending is going to be affecting actually the impulse of growth in the economy, R&D or human capital accumulation, depending on what kind of model I'm looking at. So here we have the agents that they're going to derive utility from consumption. They will not like to work, and actually they will not like also to go to school. So MT here is education hours that I dedicate to education. Sigma is going to be the usual relative risk aversion, and Xi here is going to be to express the risk elasticity of labor supply. Here we are making the assumption that this elasticity is the same for working and for hours worked. Maybe if we change this assumption, we will marginally change some of the results. Nothing significant will change. Now, what is this CT here? These people are going to consume a composite of goods, which is going to be goods that they make at home and goods that they get from the other country, okay, which is going to be the conglomerate of all the EU. So what we're going to assume is that ETA is going to characterize here the weight of the imported goods in the home consumption, okay? So if ETA is smaller than 0.5, then there's going to be some home bias in consumption. So what we're going to assume that is that consumption and investment and government expenditure are going to be all similar aggregates as the one presented in equation 4. So what we're going to have is that the goods are going to be produced and aggregated with a CES aggregator, and the elasticity of this aggregator is going to be epsilon, is the usual sticky price marker. Now, when I'm going to have human capital in the model, I'm going to assume that the human capital is going to evolve according to this equation 5. This equation 5 tells me that human capital tomorrow is actually a function of the non-depreciated human capital of today, and the depreciation of the human capital is going to depend actually on the utilization of the human capital, and is also going to depend on this term here, which is going to be measuring the productivity of the schooling. So in order for me to produce new human capital, I have to put people to get educated, and this is going to be interacted with the average, with the human capital that people have decided that they have in the previous period, and this is going to produce the new human capital. But I'm going to have an externality. The externality here is going to come from the aggregate stock of human capital, this HT bar, and from possibly, if I want to assume it this way, the investment in human capital that the government is making. This is one way to measure human capital expenditures or funds about human capital in my model economy. I will have an alternative way. The alternative way I can do it is that to assume that actually the government is not actually directly affecting the accumulation of human capital, but instead it gives subsidies here in equation 6 in this STM to the people in order to get educated. So if I decide to get educated, then I am going to get STM subsidies for my education. And this is the usual budget constraint of the households. We have complete markets. So this big term next to CT plus TAF-T is just going to be like the bonds of the set of assets for a complete state contingent real bonds. And I'm going to get income, which is going to be free of after taxes. And I'm going to get CT, the profits of the firms, because I owe these firms in this economy. Now, the retail firms do the usual stuff. I'm going to assume that I have Rothenberg adjustment cost here. So this CP is going to measure how much I have to pay for adjusting my prices. And these are like the adjustment costs are going to be faced by wholesale firms in my economy. And I'm going to have also a capital accumulation, which is going to be subject to adjustment cost as well. Now, what the fiscal authorities do is important. So what they do, they will levy a labor income and transfer tax in the households, and they are going to give this to the federal government, and the federal government is going to spend it. So the federal government is going to spend money to consumption, which is going to be thrown in the ocean, to consumption that is going to affect the human capital accumulation, or to giving subsidies to the people to study. And the monetary policy will do the standard thing, which is to follow a Taylor law rule targeting the union inflation rate. Okay, the equilibrium resource constraint is going to be kind of standard, so I will skip it. Let me go to the R&D model. In the R&D model, we are going to assume something different from before. The different thing that we're going to assume has to do with the production function. Obviously here, people are not educated because I cannot have like two state variables. So what I'm going to assume is that, sorry, not two state variables, two paths for growth. So what I'm going to assume is that output is going to be produced with effective capital, which is UK times K, and with labor. And here I have this ZT, which is going to be a labor augmented term that actually is going to be affected by the amount of spending in R&D from the part of the government. And of course, it's going to also be affected by the investment in R&D, which is DT, the DT variable here, and the utilization of R&D. Okay, I can assume this, but I can also assume something different. I can assume that the government actually is not affecting directly TFP, but instead affects the accumulation of R&D capital. And if I want to do it this way, then I would introduce the GTRD spending in equation 13, where what I'm saying is that the accumulation of R&D is going to be equal to 1 minus delta as a function of the utilization rate of the human capital times the human capital. And then what is going to be next is what I'm going to invest in human capital. But this investment can actually be also financed or enhanced by the government. So in this case, government spending will enter the accumulation of R&D. And finally, I can also assume a subsidy here. And in this case, what is going to happen is that the wholesale firms are going to have profits that they are not going to depend only on how much they have to pay on wages and investment, but they will receive some money out of the investment they make in R&D, which is this term here, STRD times ST. So yes, I don't have time about the calibration. Let me explain you a little bit the intuition here. So independently of how I'm going to model the funding of R&D in the economy, what you see in the theoretical model is that an increase in the government spending in R&D, which is the left panel on this multiple panel here, the left top panel, what this shock is going to generate is going to generate R&D growth. You can see that in the right top panel of the figure here. So obviously, not all the instruments are going to affect the same R&D growth, but what it is important to notice is that they all going to create growth. At the same time, this is an increase in government absorption in the short run, which is going to generate also some demand effects. So we have a shock that has supply side effects and demand effects at the same time. So what this is going to generate is going to generate positive effects on output. Okay, so here that you see on the left column, the first column of the graph here on the second row, you can see that GVA is going to increase, and we see that capital investment increases. When capital investment increases the most, well, it's going to increase the most when actually R&D is going to affect directly the TFP accumulation. I don't have time to go to the details, but that is how the propagation of these shocks will look like in this economy. Now, when we look at shocks to ESF or to human capital accumulation shocks, what we have is that an increase in this spending in human capital is going to actually affect the economy the same way, whether I'm going to assume that I have a subsidy or I'm going to have an externality in the accumulation of human capital from the government funds. How does this work? Well, I increase the human capital spending in the economy, and what I'm going to have to do is that people, they will want to be educated more. Where do you see that? In the third middle, in the third row, middle column of the graph. So there you see that education hours increase, and actually this means that working hours are actually crowded out. As a result, this is going to lead to a fall of the GVA in the short run. But in the medium run, what is going to happen is that the effect of human capital growth that you see here in the top row of the middle column of the graph shows is that human capital growth will take place, and this is going to generate medium-term effects for the investments in human capital. So we calculate then multipliers in the model as the ones that we have calculated in the empirics. And as you can see, if we look, for example, at R&D shocks, we see that if we assume that R&D enters the TFP directly, we get kind of high multipliers, both on impact and after 3 years cumulative, and they don't dissipate that fast. Instead, if we assume that R&D spending is used in the R&D accumulation or as an R&D subsidies, the multipliers are smaller and they dissipate pretty fast. Now, in terms of human capital, whatever we're going to assume, we're going to have the same pattern in which the first year multiplier is going to be small and it's going to increase with time. Now, we don't get the numbers, we don't get the 8s and the 5s that we were getting in the data. And the reason is that our modeling choice here are limited. We have human capital that is moving slowly, so we would not be able to generate after 3 periods in our model a multiplier as huge as 8. Okay, we could do some things, but we would not be able to arrive to such big numbers. Anyways, what I wanted to show you is that the model is so rich that I can generate any of the patterns of multipliers that I have shown you in the data. If we look at the left panel here, for example, of this graph, I can generate multipliers that they become negative very soon, like we have seen in young members of the EU. And this is by assuming that actually the R&D shock is something that happens very fast and then it is reversing. So this is what is going to give me like this kind of multipliers. I can generate multipliers even for R&D that they increase with time. And this is going to be attained if I assume that the productivity of the public good takes time to actually be generated. So as a result, I have the demand effect of the shock coming in and the supply effect of the shock is coming like in later periods. I can generate lag effects, etc., and also the spillover effects that I see also in the data. I mean, the right panel is kind of more messy because we have more cases there. But in general, we would be able to generate also the patterns that we see for the H-K shock. What I wanted to do before closing, and sorry if I took a little bit more time, but I'm finishing in 1 second, is that what we can do in the model is what we cannot do in the data, which is to consider questions like, is it better to take grants or is it better to take grants and loans? Did Spain do well not to take grants versus Italy that took both grants and loans, etc.? So what we do here is that we are considering this experiment in which actually we assume that the fiscal authority can actually get the grants as in the baseline economy, or it can actually ask loans to finance these investments. So what happens in this case? Like, to make a short story short, no, it's not short. A long story short, what we see is that whenever we are assuming loans, we get a lower multiplier. It is not very important for some cases. For example, as you can see, if R&D is enhancing TFP, whether you get grants on loans would not make a big difference. It would make a big difference instead if actually you are giving subsidies. If you give subsidies and you decide to get loans for giving subsidies, this is a very bad idea, because actually you're destroying a lot of the labor supply, and actually you don't pick up the effects, the positive effects on growth that these funds would generate. Another thing that it is good to see here is to see what happens if you have loans and grants instead of only grants for the case of HK shocks, like human capital shocks. Here you understand, I mean, I have a shock to human capital. I want to go to work. I want to go to study. I don't want to go to work. Now, if they put me also a tax that I have to pay because I have to go to work, then this effect is actually multiplied even more. So I don't, like, the labor supply is reducing like very, very much, and this generates a very negative effect of the shock in the short run. But because human capital is going to increase the productivity of the economy in the longer run, this effect is actually getting reversed after 3 years, and actually multipliers, whether you have grants on loans or only grants, do not differ that much. So I am sorry I took some more time. I think I will pass the conclusions, and maybe we'll come back to the question and answer session to give you any answers or even conclusions if you wish. I hope I didn't tire you with taking 5 minutes more.